I observe in the dramatic apology offered by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein a systemic crisis of institutional trust that extends far beyond Starmer as an individual or the misjudgment regarding Peter Mandelson, and that exposes in its full scope the structural vulnerabilities of democratic leadership systems. What may appear on the surface as a classic political scandal reveals itself, upon closer analysis, as a symptomatic expression of a deeper legitimacy crisis within Western elite structures, which are being systematically destabilized by the ongoing revelations surrounding the Epstein network, raising fundamental questions about the integrity, judgment, and accountability of the political leadership class. The structural roots of this British government crisis run deep into the institutional weaknesses of the Westminster system and the informal power networks of the political class, which made it possible for a figure like Peter Mandelson, despite his well-known connections to Epstein and his scandal-ridden past, marked by 2 previous resignations from government office, to once again attain a position of the highest diplomatic responsibility. Starmer's decision in December 2024 to appoint Mandelson as British ambassador to Washington did not occur in a political vacuum, but was the result of a political culture that values personal connections and presumed expertise more highly than ethical integrity and institutional probity. The fact that the appointment was approved by the security services despite known Epstein connections reveals systemic failures within the oversight mechanisms of the British state. The temporal dimension of this crisis significantly amplifies its political explosiveness, as Starmer only dismissed Mandelson in September 2025 after 8 months in office as ambassador, when further incriminating emails regarding his friendship with Epstein after Epstein's 2008 conviction were made public. New documents released by the US Department of Justice in January 2026, now totaling more than 3 million pages, reveal an alarming extent of the Mandelson-Epstein relationship, including payments of $75,000 between 2003 and 2004, as well as indications that Mandelson may have shared sensitive government information about the 2008 financial crisis with Epstein. These revelations transform the case from a personnel policy error into a potential national security risk and raise fundamental questions about the compromise of British government circles by the Epstein network. Starmer's desperate apology of February 5, 2026, "I am sorry that I believed Mandelson's lies and appointed him," reveals the precarious position of a prime minister caught between the Scylla of personal responsibility and the Charybdis of institutional accountability. His claim to have been lied to and to have known nothing of the depth and darkness of the Mandelson-Epstein relationship paradoxically undermines his own authority, as it implies either blatant naivety or a deliberate ignorance of publicly available information. The fact that Starmer never personally met Epstein and is accused of no personal wrongdoing offers only limited political protection against allegations of poor judgment and insufficient due diligence in appointments of such sensitivity. I perceive in the growing rebellion within the Labour Party against Starmer's leadership a structural manifestation of the tensions between moral expectations and pragmatic constraints that characterise all democratic parties as they navigate between adherence to principles and the preservation of power. Public criticisms from Labour MPs such as Paula Barker, the Prime Minister, has shown that his judgment is questionable, signal not merely personal dissatisfaction with Starmer, but reflect the existential anxiety of a party that, after its historic electoral victory in July 2024, now finds itself confronted with the prospect of a humiliating loss of public trust. Internal party demands for the dismissal of Starmer's Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney, regarded as the architect of Mandelson's appointment, illustrate the scapegoating dynamics that threaten to tear political organisations apart in times of crisis. The opposition is systematically exploiting this crisis to undermine the fundamental competence of the Labour government and to establish alternative visions of leadership. Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch and Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey have already called for confidence votes, while Nigel Farage Reform UK continues to lead Labour in the polls, an extraordinary reversal of political dynamics only months after Labour's triumphant electoral victory. This opposition strategy aims not only at Starmer's immediate downfall, but at the systematic delegitimization of the Labour government as a whole and the positioning of alternative political forces as credible options for frustrated voters. The institutional implications of this crisis extend far beyond the future of the current government, and raise fundamental questions about the effectiveness of British security vetting processes, the transparency of diplomatic appointments, and the accountability mechanisms for senior political appointees. The Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee has already indicated that it cannot guarantee a timetable for reviewing Mandelson's vetting documents, promising further delays and prolonged political uncertainty. This institutional inertia intensifies public frustration over the lack of transparency and fuels conspiracy theories about elite protection and systematic cover-ups. The international ramifications of this British domestic political crisis are particularly delicate given the critical phase of US-UK relations under Donald Trump's second presidency and the complex geopolitical challenges in the Middle East, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. Mandelson's dismissal as ambassador at precisely a time when his expertise in dealing with Trump was considered valuable leaves a diplomatic gap that will be difficult to fill in the short term. The entanglement of the US-UK special relationship with the toxic revelations of the Epstein scandal creates additional complexities for both governments as they seek to disentangle their bilateral agenda from the shadows of this affair. The media dynamics surrounding this crisis illustrate the transformed information landscape in which the traditional gatekeeping functions of the established press are systematically bypassed by the continuous release of primary documents by US authorities. The Epstein files create a situation in which political narratives are no longer controllable and established PR strategies prove ineffective as the factual basis continues to expand. This document-based transparency forces political actors into reactive positions and eliminates traditional opportunities for damage control through strategic communication. Based on the structural analysis of the underlying political dynamics, I project 3 likely scenarios for Starmer's political survival and the further development of this crisis. Scenario 1 involves a gradual erosion of Starmer's authority without an immediate resignation, turning his government into a lame duck administration incapable of implementing substantive political reforms, yet remaining in office due to the lack of a unified opposition within the Labour Party. Scenario 2 entails a coordinated rebellion by leading Labour figures, leading to a confidence vote and Starmer's forced resignation, followed by a chaotic leadership contest that would paralyse the party for months. Scenario 3 projects an escalation of revelations through further releases of Epstein documents, implicating additional British politicians and triggering a systemic crisis of the political establishment that extends beyond individual figures. The psychological aspects of this crisis reveal the particular vulnerabilities of democratic leaders who must simultaneously claim moral authority. Starmer's public admission of having been lied to, though intended as an apology, functions as a demonstration of naivety and lack of due diligence, qualities that may be perceived as disqualifying for a prime minister operating in a complex geopolitical environment. The emotional dimension of his apology to Epstein's victims reflects an attempt to regain moral credibility, but may be interpreted as instrumental and insincere. The broader societal implications of this affair intensify the already existing alienation between political elites and the public, which perceives a continuity of scandals, privileges, and lack of accountability. The fact that a figure like Mandelson, despite repeated ethical failures, could be continuously recycled into positions of power fuels populist narratives of a rigged system and elite corruption. This dynamic favors anti-establishment forces and undermines trust in democratic institutions and processes. The contemporary relevance of the Epstein scandal as an ongoing source of political instability demonstrates the long-term costs of elite compromise and the impossibility of simply forgetting or ignoring such systemic corruption networks. Documentary evidence creates a new form of political accountability that transcends traditional damage control mechanisms and systematically challenges established power structures. This development could set a precedent for future transparency-based challenges to political systems worldwide. The constitutional dimensions of the British crisis raise questions about the adequacy of traditional Westminster mechanisms for modern challenges of political accountability. The absence of fixed terms for prime ministers provides flexibility for leadership changes but can also lead to permanent instability when trust erodes systematically. The role of the monarch in such crises remains largely ceremonial, adding further uncertainty regarding ultimate mechanisms for resolving political conflicts. I recognize in this British government crisis a paradigmatic example of the structural vulnerabilities of Western democracies. In an era of heightened transparency and documentary evidence, where traditional elite protective barriers are systematically eroding and political leaders are held accountable for historical decisions and associations. What began as an isolated personnel decision is evolving into an existential challenge for the entire political system, whose legitimacy and effectiveness are being systematically undermined by the ongoing revelations of elite compromise. The economic dimensions of this political instability are already manifesting in volatile markets and reduced investor confidence, as international actors increasingly question the British government's capacity to act. Starmer's original promises of economic growth and institutional stability after 14 years of conservative mismanagement now appear hollow in light of his own political vulnerability and the persistent uncertainty over governance. The Labour Party, which came to power with expectations of fundamental reform and ethical renewal, now finds itself confronted with accusations of continuity with the very elite privileges it had promised to combat. European allies of the United Kingdom are observing these developments with growing concern, as political instability in London further complicates relationships already strained by Brexit. NATO partners must adjust their strategic calculations when one of the most important military allies is affected by internal political paralysis. The technological aspects of information dissemination are creating new precedents for political accountability, rendering traditional control mechanisms obsolete. Social media enable direct access to primary sources and amplify the volatility of political crises. The legal dimension is developing in parallel with the political crisis as police investigate Mandelson for potential abuses of office, thereby establishing precedents for the criminal prosecution of senior political figures who may have shared sensitive information with compromised actors. These legal proceedings are likely to last for years and will constitute a continuous source of political uncertainty, systematically undermining Starmer's authority even if he remains in office. Historical parallels to previous British political crises, from the Profumo affair to the MP's Expenses scandal, reveal recurring patterns of elite privilege, institutional failure, and public outrage that systematically erode trust in democratic governance. These cycles of scandal and reform demonstrate the limits of institutional learning and the persistence of structural problems that cannot be resolved through superficial reforms. The future of British democracy will depend on whether its institutions are capable of managing this crisis of accountability without sacrificing their fundamental stability and capacity to govern, a balancing act between transparency and governance that may significantly shape the fate of liberal democracies in the 21st century.